welcome to Groups. So glad that you've joined us. And I've got Pastor Mike here helping us to walk through Ephesians chapter 6.
Right.
Hitting the home stretch of going through Ephesians together here. And last week, we looked at this passage of Scripture that says, and further submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. We talked about how Paul, this is kind of the overarching theme to getting into talking about relationships and what it looks like to live in reverence for Christ in all of our relationships. Right. So last week we looked at the relationships and really power dynamics between men and women. Mm-hmm. Then we're going to get into parents and kids, and then masters and slaves. So a little bit about last week, just so again in review, as we talked about the power dynamics between men and women, Paul says that in a marriage there should be mutual submission, sacrifice, respect, even love is mentioned in that. I don't know, any wisdom you want to give us in the area of marriage?
Since my wife isn't here, I guess I can give some wisdom. No, I think, well, really, it's Paul's just helping us to see that this is in all of our relationships, right? Mm-hmm. It shouldn't be any different. Especially it should be in our marriages and the way we treat our wives. And as we know, the culture back then in Bible times was very much where the husband was, the boss, the authoritarian in the family, and the wife was almost property in some ways. And so this was pretty crazy idea for Christian community to begin to love your wives and respect them and have that mutual respect for one another. Mm-hmm. Maybe even for wives to respect the husband because they've always been such a force and many times maybe abusive or not so loving. And so maybe it was hard for some of the wives also to submit and have mutual respect for that authority, know?
Yeah. And he doesn't stop there. He gets into the relationships between parents and children, which may be even more radical than what he's suggesting for mutual submission between man and wife.
And I think you have some background.
Yeah. So we need some context on this as you guys get into this in your groups. A little bit about how children were valued in especially this Roman culture. It says, by including these verses about parents and kids, Paul dignifies the place of the child in the Christian home and community. Such concern was not the attitude of the ancient world. Roman practice gave the father absolute power over his children. He had the right to punish them as his wrath might sinfully dictate, to sell them into slavery if he thought they were too expensive or worthless to him, or under certain conditions he could have them put to death.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah. So this is the culture.
I mean, there's times I've wanted to sell my kids into slavery, but I can't imagine that it would be okay. That's the crazy thing of that culture is that was accepted.
Yeah.
And so what Paul's talking about here is very radical. It would definitely stand out in a community.
Yeah.
I would say so.
Yeah, and all the children say, yay.
I'm sure.
But even with children, it says that they should honor their parents. They should practice obedience. And then I love where Paul says that, it's the parents' job to train their children. Right. And to not do that where it exasperates them or anything like that. Sure. But so there's a responsibility for training, but there's also a responsibility on the children for obedience. And sometimes I think of our own culture and we take such a kid-centric view of things that, we have kids running like crazy, running the household and being disrespectful. Like there is this, we come together, everybody has their part to play in mutual submission to Christ.
We almost change roles to where they are running the family.
It can. Yeah. We've seen that happen.
Sure. If we're not careful. And I think it's very interesting that I believe that Paul talks, this is actually the commandment for kids to honor their parents comes with a blessing, right? That they'll have long life. And I've never thought about it before, but the fact that the father has the authority to be able to put somebody to death or sell them into slavery, you can see maybe that is so that your life will go well with you and that you'll have long life. But even for us today, I think it's just that when you honor your parents, I think society looks better on those kids as well. And that in time that they're not going to get maybe into some other trouble in society.
If you have parents who are diligently walking with Christ, you want to follow that wisdom that they have that you don't have because you're just not old enough and life experienced enough to.
Of course, you don't know that. You think you know it all.
Right. Right. Yeah. All right. So he doesn't stop there. He kind of goes through the home and says, relationships with husbands and wives. It goes through the home, relationships between parents and kids. Right. And then he starts diving into what we can kind of see as the workplace. Right. He talks about masters and slaves, and that's really hard for us to understand too. It
is.
Because what Paul is not doing is condoning slavery here. No. The workforce was you were either an owner or you were a slave. There's no middle class. You're just at the mercy of whomever. And some of these slaves were people that their parents had sold them into slavery. Right. A little bit of context in on that. I want to make sure I get this one right because it was really good too. It says the world of the Apostles' day was a world filled with slavery. It had been estimated that there were over 60 million slaves just within the Roman Empire of itself. So we can read this passage of scripture and not really know how do we apply that to our lives today?
Yeah, I mean, it was the society that they all accepted and kind of went along with, and I think when they begin to talk about slaves and again, it's relationship. And today we can look at employee, employer, whether you're boss or you're the employee, those types of relationships, because it's all the socioeconomic side of life. And when we're out in the world and working, how do we get along? How are we different, and how can we show Jesus to the rest of the world? Yeah. And that's a way, by standing out and honoring, having obedience, serving one another. If you're a boss and you are caring for your people, you have people who want to work for you. Mm-hmm. They love it. They love to come to work because they know you care, and it does make a difference. I think it can really change people's perception of God, even. Right,
because we are a representation of Christ.
Sure.
And we really need to take that into respect, especially if we sit in a position of power or authority. Mm-hmm. We are representative of Christ in that. And even if we're not, we're still a representative of Christ in the ways that we serve one another. And the few keywords that come out of that passage, is again, obedience and respect in the working relationship, serving one another. And then the idea of fair treatment comes into play underneath Paul's teaching as well. So.
Yeah. And just, again, it all goes back to the golden rule of loving God and loving others. And if we love them like we love ourselves and we treat them that way, I believe, it should be a way of life for us. And I think that's what Paul's trying to say. He's giving examples and just saying, here's how that plays in our life. At home, with your wife, with your children, at work, wherever you go. I mean, he could have went on and on and on with all of this, playing it out. Whenever you're out in the world, whatever you're doing, you should be a representative of Christ, and we should have mutual respect for people. Yeah. Even today, people who may not believe the same way that we believe or have different ideals, different things like that, we can love them, we can care for them, we can have respect for them.
Right. Yeah, there's always room for that.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Jesus, he has this encounter with a couple of his disciples. Actually, their mom kind of sets them up and says, like, hey, I want my sons to sit at your right and your left. And this whole conversation that happens. And
I think she probably had something to gain with that.
A power play for sure on the part of a mom. But, and then it causes all this arguing in the realm of the disciples. And but Jesus closes this kind of how he addresses it. He closes it out by saying, whoever wants to be first among you must first be your slave, for even the Son of Man came to serve and not be served. Yeah. And so we can always look at the example of Christ in the way that we walk in our relationships with one another, to serve, to not be served. Mm-hmm. That's the way of Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, if we can apply that in every part of our life, you really don't have to worry about all the other things that are in Scripture. And sometimes we're worried about, am I doing this right? Am I doing that right? If we're loving and serving others and caring about others in the name of Christ, it changes things. It changes the world. Yeah. And again, I think it's hard for us to understand how radical it was back then because of the culture,
Right.
Even the slave to master thing. That's just unheard of.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I hope you guys enjoy your time in your groups, getting to kind of talk through this passage of how following Jesus impacts our entire relationship with one another. As always, we just pray that you would be a church that's known for love. Have a great week.